Good afternoon, and welcome to yet another extremely topical and extremely timely AMET webinar. As all of you know, AMET is a premier Washington think tank and policy shop. Our policymakers have learned to rely upon us and to trust us in our daily briefings to offer accurate, nonpartisan knowledge about the Middle East and on Capitol Hill. Our efforts have made a difference. Looking back, we know that we have made an impact to help create a more secure future for the United States and for the state of Israel over our past 17 years. We get no government grants and rely entirely on viewers such as yourselves to keep us afloat. If you like what you see and hear today and have been tuning into our weekly webinars, we urge you to please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to www.ametonline.org. Also, we're delighted to constantly partner with our wonderful colleagues at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Please also consider making a contribution to their vital work at www.fdd.org. We would also like to thank our partners at JNS for writing about our weekly webinars and for embedding them in their columns. We are honored to have with us today an outstanding senior fellow from FDD, Behnam Ben Taleblu. Behnam focuses on Iranian security and political issues for FDD. Prior to his time at FDD, Behnam worked on non-proliferation issues at an arms control think tank in Washington, D.C. Leveraging his subject matter expertise and his native Farsi skills, Behnam has closely tracked a wide range of Iranian-related topics, including nuclear non-proliferation, ballistic missiles, sanctions, the IRGC, the foreign and security policy of the Islamic Republic, and internal Iranian policies. Frequently called upon to brief journalists and congressional staff and other Washington audiences, Behnam has also testified before the U.S. Congress and the Canadian Parliament. His analyses have been quoted in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, Fox News, the Associated Press, and Agence France Presse, among others. Additionally, he's penned or co-penned articles for Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Fox News, The Hill, War on the Rocks, The National Interest, and U.S. News and World Report. He has appeared on a variety of broadcast programs, including BBC News, Fox News, CBS Interactive, C-SPAN, and Defense News. Behnam earned his BA at GW and his MA in International Relations from the University of Chicago. As most of you are aware, when our U.S. envoy to Iran, Robert Malley, sat before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for his confirmation hearing back in January of 2021, we were promised a longer, stronger deal. Beginning in April of 2021, and for well over a year, the U.S. administration, together with the other P5+1 countries, Great Britain, France, Germany, China, and Russia, have met no less than 8 times in Vienna trying to hammer out a nuclear deal. While we were promised a longer, stronger deal by this administration, one that would have addressed the fatal flaws of the 2015 deal, including those of Iran's missile development, its malign behavior throughout the region, including its support for global terrorism, and its looming sunset clauses, one of which has already elapsed in October of 2020. They and the JCPOA, in a few short years, will enable Iran to become a member of the nuclear club. And we all know what that means. Just look at the malign behavior of Russia or of North Korea. Way back in November of 2021, Ali Bagheri Khani, the lead negotiator for Iran, wrote a piece for the Financial Times of London saying that his primary objective in engaging in the talks was sanctions relief. It was purely economic. It is certainly clear by now that the Iranians had absolutely no motivation to engage in talks for a quote-unquote longer, stronger deal. Their motivation was strictly financial. The Biden administration seemed to feel that negotiating obtaining a deal with the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism would be some sort of foreign policy victory. We've been negotiating from a position of weakness, absent any credible threat of military force, which actually is the only way one can negotiate with a brutal terrorist regime with hegemonic aspirations. The Iranians have sensed our desperation, and they have thrown in all sorts of bells and whistles for themselves, continuing to up the ante. These have included removing the IRGC from the State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations, and for us to be able to provide assurances that any new administration would never renegotiate another deal. The first demand about removing the IRGC from the FTO was met with huge bipartisan pushback from both the Senate and from the House, from Gold Star families, and from over 70 foreign policy experts. And the second, about never ever renegotiating a deal with Iran, would be impossible according to the US Constitution, without submitting the agreement to the US Senate for 2/3 of the members to ratify as a treaty. By the time Special Envoy Robert Malley testified before the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee on May 25th, he described the prospects of reaching a deal with Iran as, quote, tenuous at best. Meanwhile, according to David Albright and Sarah Beckhart from the Good ISIS, the Institute for Science and International Security, as well as Andrea Stricker from FDD, breakout time has been reduced to 0, and within 1 to 5 months, they can have 3 nuclear bombs. The IAEA has recently found traces of uranium at several undeclared sites, and there are images of a new site way underground at Fordo, where they will be installing new IR-6 centrifuges. In early June, Iran told the IAEA that it planned to remove equipment, including 27 cameras, which is, quote, basically all the extra monitoring equipment installed under the 2015 deal. IAEA Director Rafael Grossi told a news conference that this would be, quote, a fatal blow to the deal, and that they had 3 to 4 weeks to reinstall them or the deal is off. They have not reinstalled the 27 cameras. The US, Great Britain, Germany, and France submitted a resolution to the IAEA censoring Iran, and the 35-member agency overwhelmingly voted to censor them. My question to you, Bedam, is, are prospects of a renewed nuclear deal with Iran effectively off? Will the Biden administration have the intellectual integrity and moral clarity to level with the American people about this, or will they just let it wither on the vine?
Well, first and foremost, Sarah, everyone, and Emmett, and everyone who tuned in virtually for this segment today, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for that very warm introduction, but also for that very honest scene setter, because things don't look that great, even from the perspective of the Biden administration, which, as you mentioned in your very thorough introduction, took a very inherently narrow, very tailored, very kind of Faustian approach to trying to do business with the Islamic Republic. And even on this front, they're having trouble. And it's not trouble related to a rising China or finding a way to deter North Korea, or just because of the Russia-Ukraine war and the ensuing humanitarian, political, economic, and social fallout from that. What it really is in fact, ascendancy. It's a kind of hyper confidence or an overconfidence on, you mentioned the regime in the past year and a half of indirect nuclear negotiations, which have been indirect not because of anything Washington has done, but because of a demand the Iranians had with the then outgoing, allegedly but not really moderate Rouhani government in Iran, and sustained by the new ultra hardline Raisi administration in Iran, which actually boasts over 40% of its sitting cabinet members as sanctioned either under US, EU, UN, UK, or even Interpol red notices. That's for an Iranian cabinet to have almost half of its members subject to some kind of international sanction. That should tell you that the regime isn't worried about the face it's presenting to the international community. Gone are the days where Western analysts would count the number of Western PhDs in the Iranian cabinet. this is a hardliners hardline cabinet, and they're playing ball like hardliners play ball. And what that means is they believe, given how public our domestic discourse has been, given how needlessly political the Iran issue has been treated in Washington, particularly since the advent of the JCPOA in mid-2015, up until how it was part of every single Republican versus Democratic debate or discussion, whether on Capitol Hill or actually for multiple presidential campaigns. And that's not to say we shouldn't have the kind of debates that we do, and we need to remain a free and open society, but we have to be aware that as we make arguments against someone across the aisle, America's authoritarian adversaries are more attuned to these types of arguments. And for the campaign period of most of 2020, the Iranians, just like everyone around the world, heard the Biden campaign say that sanctions don't work, heard them denigrate maximum pressure, heard them denigrate America's most powerful and peaceful tool of punishment, coercion, and deterrence. And in an attempt to do what many American administrations do, which is normal, which is you seek a sharp contrast from the foreign policy you inherit, and you keep the things that you like. And, you can prove structure one way and prove human agency another way. And in this sense, the Biden administration looked to repudiate the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. I think actually the more time we get away from it, the more right the move was. We can all take umbrage or gripes with the way the move was done, the tactics and the way it was done, how to manage alliances, but ultimately a bad deal is a bad deal is a bad deal. And there's no fat on that statement. So with the administration looking to overcompensate for this, the Iranians understood that. And when that dynamic began to congeal, as you mentioned, April 2021, when Longer and Stronger was dropped and those indirect negotiations were able to happen, the Iranians sensed something that they sensed in 2014, 2015, which is that America seeks a deal for political reasons more than the Iranians need a deal for economic reasons. And the unenforced sanctions that we saw due to the administration not wanting to look like its predecessor, not wanting to look like its predecessor to the US domestic audience, to try to draw a sharp contrast from Trump, but also to try to draw a sharp contrast from Trump to the Iranians to say, hey, look, you can actually negotiate with us. Those penalties that they inherited remained on the books, but were not actively enforced. So the regime was able to significantly accumulate revenues in 2021 in the illicit oil, particularly crude output space, and the petrochemical and other petroleum and non-petroleum derivative space, most, though not all of which, went to East Asia, particularly China. There was also significant non-dollar trade, regional trade, and petrochemical trade for the Islamic Republic in this time that was very, very selectively punished. So one reason we don't have a deal now, despite Biden trying very, very hard, and I think if there ever really was a case to try to prove who is at fault in this 4-decade debacle, Washington or Tehran, you could say the Biden administration tried harder than many other administrations, Republican or Democrat, to try to overcome divides. They're not looking to transform the relationship, but even to try to do something transactional, like resurrect the fatally flawed nuclear deal. They're having a very hard time. So Iran's Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, that's the title meant to be taken very literally, is ascendant. He doesn't believe Biden has a plan B because Biden has denigrated the idea of pressure for the past year and a half, politically and tactically. So he doesn't see a U.S. pivot to pressure coming anytime soon. He's buoyed quite figuratively and literally by these extra oil revenues. Yes, there is a little bit of a downturn of Iranian crude to China because of increasing Russian oil sales, because Russia is looking to offset its Ukraine-related sanctions. But ultimately, the regime believes, and through its practice, does have enough cash on hand to sustain nuclear escalation, to sustain its revolutionary foreign and security policy, to continue to use proxies to target U.S. friends, partners, allies, and interests, be it the GCC states or particularly even Israel. And they don't feel there is this plan B coming. And I know you and your audience and everyone here has been really attuned to talk of plan B since the administration even began to talk of it with that historic visit in, I think it was August 2021, with Bennett coming to Washington. But I think there's something else in store. And that's something else I think in store and that we need to know and we need to socialize is a plan C. I think the administration will not admit that talks have collapsed. Just look at what's going on right now. There's been pause hit since mid-March, since prior to Persian New Year, which happens at the spring equinox. It's called Nowruz. It happens in mid-spring. There was a break taken then, and that break has been sustained. It wasn't just a holiday break. That break also happened as the regime allegedly raised this question of, again, trying to get the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a designated foreign terrorist organization, off the US FTO list. Depending on the sources you read and who you trust and what you believe coming out of the State Department versus Politico versus the Washington Post, it looks like the administration is not budging on that. But the administration is also still not budging on trying to work overtime to resurrect a deal that would ultimately pay the people in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps through a bunch of banks and businesses that would get some kind of sanctions relief that would ultimately still underwrite Iran's terrorism apparatus. So we still have that larger problem here. And I think the administration, even though you've seen some very good, and we have to applaud things that are productive and in the US national interest, no matter who does them, in late May, you had a very significant multi-domain 4-country-wide oil sanctions enforcement measure that was critical. And just last week, you had a petrochemical sanctions enforcement measure, which also did go after fronts and those who help Iranian petrochemical producers smuggle and illicitly sell some of these petrochemical products to places like China, for instance. So those are good, but those moves have to be sustained. They have to be stepped up. But the Iranians don't think those moves will be coming anytime soon. And in all fairness, the track record doesn't look like it. So when I say the Biden administration has, that means that they believe that pressure drives the program. They don't believe that agency or Iranian will or Iranian strategy drives their program. And that means that they're going to be remiss to add pressure in a sustained fashion. And at most, you'll see this sporadic, incremental kind of pressure. Just look what happened with the referral, the resolution of censure just a few days ago. International Atomic Energy Agency finally issued a resolution of censure. This is just a diplomatic finger wagging for the Iranians who have obscured access and not providing sufficient information to the IAEA about undeclared sites and undeclared traces of man-made uranium, sites and material we wouldn't have known about had the Atomic Archive not been exposed and taken and revealed. And ultimately, those things were followed up upon, and they added to the good work that the IAEA had done and things the IAEA had revealed about Iran's past military dimensions for its nuclear program, stuff that was made famous in 2008 and 2011 reporting. And ultimately, Iran thinks it can have its cake and eat it too right now. And the administration, given where we are politically with the midterms, is likely to want to talk about Iran, not just from this national security perspective, but from this oil and economic perspective. That is why you see a 180 from the US on Maduro and Venezuela. Even though Maduro was just in Tehran, he just gave a famous interview to the Supreme Leader's website, talking about how he even met Soleimani once. This is really worth reading. It exists out there in English. I recommend the audience go check it out. But also to try to talk about getting Iranian oil online to potentially offset the rising oil costs here. So there is this perfect storm brewing. But I think, in short, expect the plan C from Biden, given Khamenei's intransigence, because Khamenei is economically still ascendant, despite everything we see going on in the streets, politically believes that he can still hold one over on the US. And ideologically, there's still that incentive. If Iran is negotiating with the US for 1.5 years indirectly, it's not because the regime is trying to become a good nuclear stakeholder. What it's trying to do is ultimately try to humiliate the US, which it still continues to call the great state and chant death to America too. So it's serving a larger component of Iranian national security strategy. And that's something we need to keep in mind. But I think the response is going to be at most just no glide path to the UN snapback sanctions. We'll see what happens in the summer with the potential summer of more nuclear escalation by Iran coming. But ultimately, I think you're going to see sporadic sanctions enforcement and no admission that talks have collapsed. Because I think in the Biden administration's theory of the case, to say that would be to permanently shut the door on diplomacy rather than to actually bolster your hand through coercive diplomacy. So that's, I think, where we are. And I think we need to be realistic with how we got to where we are.
So Plan C is basically just sporadic, intermittent sanctions.
Without, and the key part is without admitting the failure of the talks. So the administration seems to believe as long as you don't admit the failure, you have some kind of a cap on the conflict. But I turn it over to the administration. What kind of cap on the conflict is there when the regime is installing more and wanting to use more IR6 hyper advanced centrifuges in an underground bunker at Fordo, is literally tunneling as we speak to build a new facility at Natanz, which was one of its older facilities that was discovered in 2002. This is going to be a new one, probably Fordo-esque, because it's going to be under natural cover. It's going to be underground, and ultimately continuing to enrich uranium beyond 3.5 to 5%, beyond 20% to 60%, and they've stockpiled one bomb's worth. These things are historic first, and even if you get the best deal, you can't take away because they've now learned that. So I turn it over to the administration. How does not admitting the talks collapse help us with any of this stuff?
Right. So you know that the government of Israel realizes that they're under direct existential threat. If they, and you know that they have had their hugest military drill, Chariots of Fire, that's been ongoing for a while now. Do you believe that if Israel does feel that they do have to strike out against at least some of Iran's nuclear sites, that they will help in any way? The Biden administration will support Israel, and
that the U.S. would help
in any way, would they?
I think given how political the issue is, and even when you look at past, the past kind of counter-proliferation strikes Israel at Iraq in 81 and Syria in 2007, these are qualitatively different kind of programs. It was one spot, it was one reactor, it was above ground, air defenses and military capabilities aside, it's just operationally a very different kind of mission. So in my view, if the strike is going to be successful, not that even no one is being a proponent of the strike right now, but just in the hypothetical scenario where the reality that Israel faces every day, the kind of increasing proxy and military and nuclear escalation kind of pressure. There was just an article, I don't know, we should probably raise this for the audience, but in a conservative Tehran daily paper called Resalat, it's a newspaper, there was just a longer kind of op-ed over the weekend, basically citing this increased Israeli pushback and the operations on Iranian soil and whatever, and saying that the Iranians should be striking directly at Israeli territory. And they re-upped the threat that Khamenei first made in 2013, where Haifa and Tel Aviv are specifically cited. So those people who continue to debate, does Iran really mean what it says, and what kind of regime is this? They're literally giving you the target set. So this is the background that we need to draw for this. So to get from this reality to the hypothetical, I think if there ever would be a strike, the U.S. it would be in its interest to participate in it rather than to let it be a one-off that is absorbed, because there would be tactical and operational things just based on what is reported in the open source. No deep insight here that I think would make the strike more complex for Israel and diminish the chances of success. So if there is military force by Israel being used as a counter-proliferation tool against Iran, to me, it would be both in the interest of the US and Israel, if you ever get to that very unfortunate kind of scenario, that both states do partner up. Now, I have no idea where the Biden administration is on this, because even things that would potentially allow Israel to do it itself, or even in a more limited fashion itself, like more aerial fueling and the KC-46, Israel still remains on the bottom of the list related to that. So there are plus, of course, the politics of the situation. And I think the Iranians understand this, because there was an article in Tasnim news agency, I think a few months back, and very interesting take that the Iranians, who again are paying more attention to our domestic politics, are understanding, which is they see the signs of the fraying US-Israel relationship as the signs of the demise of Israel. And obviously, you have all these, pro-regime folks in Iran who are always saying Israel will not be around in 4 years or in 6 years or in 12 years or in 25 years. They've always made these odd predictions. But this was actually a very kind of unique prediction, because they talked about different flanks of the Democratic Party. They talked about structurally the US not being as interested in the Middle East. So they actually, it was an ideological piece, but it was an analytical piece. And so these are the kind of trend lines that the regime is picking up on. And I don't think we're in there yet in the hyperbolic fashion the regime may perceive the U.S.-Israeli relationship to be, and one hopes it doesn't get there. But these are all things to keep in mind, because as we have these debates, and even as you and I are publicly speaking now, they're watching, listening, calculating, and recalibrating, and we can't forget that. So while the best answer would be obviously the U.S. would be a part of it, to me, one major reason why the Iranians are still flirting with the idea of a deal, you talked about that Bagheri Khani piece saying they want sanctions relief. I actually think the Iranians understand that as long as you float the idea of a deal, it makes the U.S. it puts the U.S. in an incredibly tough spot not to support military action against Iran. And in that sense, what happened to Bibi in 2011, 2012, and coming and going, and all the politics of that, and will there be a strike? Won't there be a strike? Everyone remembers from 2010 to 2012. Every day there was a different discussion about this.
Right now, in the streets of Iran, in many provinces, there are courageous Iranians that have taken to the streets against the regime. Do you feel that with the right sort of support from the United States, we can empower these people to have a velvet counter-revolution from within?
I think since 2017, you've been seeing different iterations of this kind of outside-in, more populist, more nationalist protest. And while there always was a chasm between state and society, and as an Iranian American, it always was nice to hear that various American decision makers, left, right, Republican, Democrat, internationalist, isolationist, whatever, they all understood for decades that the Islamic Republic did not actually represent the Iranian people. The Iranian people's account and views and values and interests and worldview drastically separate. Israelis also understand this. Even when you go to Israel, travel, talk to the wider spectrum of views that exist there, from far left to far right, similar kind of understanding, which is always nice to have. But that 2017 to 2020 period of protests is critical to understand, because it happened at a time when there was peak foreign pressure. And it kind of exploded the thesis that if you support the Iranian people, it'll be the kiss of death. You had Trump very actively talking and tweeting about it. You had targeted sanctions against very localized human rights abusers and those who use weapons of war on their own population. One thing that could have been better and has been grossly missing now, but at least was debated then, was what can the US do for telecommunications support, for communication support, and for potential satellite internet services. And I think with the Ukraine war raging, there's a great analogy, and a colleague and I have actually written about this, is the applicability of potential technology like Starlink and what Elon Musk had been doing in Ukraine, which admittedly does need a compliant host government. But if there are ways that it can be smuggled in or hosted in countries abroad and then beamed in, when there's a will, there's a way. You got to get the right legal, technical, political, economic, and intelligence minds together, public-private partnerships, try to find ways so that the Iranian people who do go out to the streets quite often risk their lives across the country, get their voices out, get the message heard. And I think, Biden for the past, the administration very early had talked about putting human rights at the center of their foreign policy. And I think it was really missing in action. And it's a shame, because it was missing in action in a place like Iran, where it doesn't just have to be about, the soft issues, as it were, of human rights, which unfortunately has been deprioritized by Republicans and Democrats. But this is really one of those few areas in the world when doing the soft thing actually helps you with the hard thing. This is where your head and your heart actually can be together. This is where you can do something and go to bed, at night and feel accomplished and also secure. So all of that said, I think the idea of what kind of government or what kind of future the Iranian people have or will have should be in the hands of the Iranian people. And it's not, but they're trying to get it to that point. And that is what all these demonstrations have been about. Because whether it's teachers or labor strikes or anything else that's coming up, particularly as you saw in late May, beginning in more rural and impoverished parts of Iran, parts where there's like different ethnic minorities, whatever you have it. As long as there is this trigger, the Iranian population will come out and almost in unison, rather than cite the trigger, rather than cite the environmental issue, the economic issue, the social issue, the foreign policy issue, they go right for the jugular. They put the target on the regime, and they know their plight is not because of some technical misunderstanding with Washington, but it's about the decisions that the hard men in Tehran have made that have made their life hell. Whether that life is hell viewed through the economic, environmental, foreign policy, or whatever lens. And the Iranian people get this. It's a shame many in Washington don't.
Right, right. Well, I think it's also a shame that we see very little in the major media about this, if nothing. You know, where is CNN and Fox and Washington Post and New York Times and Wall Street Journal even about this? You know, and I know they're risking their very lives to get out there. And it is a nexus between human rights and good foreign policy for the United States. And we did this before in the Soviet Jewry movement. And we do have a precedent where we could turn to. And I would love to see more attention drawn to this.
If I may, on that super brief, just footnote, with immense respect to all the Soviet Union metaphors, which are very valid and they're a good playbook, the only caveat I always like to raise is the Islamic Republic can't even dream of being the Soviet Union, and we are still pulling our punches. You know, we didn't pull our punches in those instances you mentioned. You know, these 80s. But we are pulling our punches with an adversary the size, scale, scope, and applicability of the Islamic Republic. Yes, both the Soviet regime and the Islamic Republic are defunct in terms of ideology. You know, they were bankrupt. They sought foreign expansion. They engaged in repression of the popular will at home. And so in this way, yes, there's many similarities, and we should draw on the successful playbooks of highlighting them and pushing back and exposing and whatnot. But we should always keep in the back of our mind, we did that with that kind of major global nuclear power, and we didn't pull punches. We're pulling punches with the Islamic Republic. It makes no sense.
Right, right. America's got to get its moxie back. And with that, I would like to turn this over to my wonderful colleague, Gabe Toole, who will read some of the questions that have come in from the audience. Gabe?
Thank you so much. We've got a lot of questions. We probably won't be able to get to all of them. Feel free to continue to ask them while we have this Q&A. We've got someone in the back, Naomi, filtering them out. I'm going to start with the Plan B and Plan C. If we could go over this a little bit more. So I think the first question you mentioned, you know, the Biden administration has this Plan C, which is kind of sporadic enforcement of sanctions to try and increase that pressure. Any sense of what the timeline of a Plan C is? Because I mean, the clock is ticking. Iran is continuing to increase their nuclear program. Any idea how long a Plan C would work? Is that an ideal scenario, or do you have another recommendation in mind?
I mean, it's a great question. I have a drastically different recommendation, which is, you know, you've got to double down on Plan B, because if Plan A is diplomacy and you keep the sanctions on the books, but you don't enforce them, Plan B is you offer diplomacy, but you vigorously enforce the sanctions and you habitually add to them, and you work with your partners to more aggressively counter Iranian malign behavior in the non-nuclear space as well. Plan C is the one where you don't admit the talks collapse, so you attempt to create a cap for the competition between the US and Iran, while you sporadically enforce sanctions to placate some people at home and to also signal to the Iranians, hey, there are some consequences, you know, it does behoove you to get a deal. The problem with the Plan C issue and the timeline you raise is that because it is inherently a more political strategy, the only timeline it may be subject to is politics, which is potentially how can it be vindicated or critiqued or attacked circa the midterms or circa the presidential era, which the bar for failure could be very low or very high, depending on how it's spun. So as long as Iran doesn't weaponize, they may say, well, it behooves us to stay at the table. Or if it's contrasted with a war in this weird zero-sum framing that many in Washington have seemed to take, and it's always a bad deal or always the World War III scenario, Plan C could or would or likely might be sold that way. The thing with Plan C is that it will never be announced as a Plan C. It'll just be Plan A. They'll simply be doing a bit more on the sanctions and diplomatic pressure front. And in that sense, my issue with such a thing is that it doesn't have timelines. And you know, you saw all the stream of reporting and statements from August, when the Raisi government came in, to November, when the indirect negotiations began with the Raisi government. In that period, there was tons of statements about a closing window and a diminishing runway, and all the metaphors in the world about how time is limited. And in my past experience talking to different folks who had done more direct negotiations with Iran abroad, it was never quite clear what the timeline would be. Meaning, would there be a political stop date for negotiations, a change in one allied country's coalition, or would it be a technical thing that Iran would have to do to invalidate the idea of talking? And while many seemed to want to talk about this not being an accurate enough framing, what I'll just simply say, zooming out now and bringing my own view in, is that, Iran has crossed almost every technical barrier. So if one did believe, whether you're the US government or a different government, if one did believe that, there was a technical stop point to these negotiations, I would simply say that, prove it to me. The Iranians have gone to 20% to 60%, 60% they threatened for a decade to do. And this is not a, critique of America or Europe or even Russia and China, which have tried to get Iran to play ball at different points of time. This is an intellectual critique, which is, at what point does the utility of trying to tempt Iran end? And I think it ended long ago. But many things that seem to exist in Washington, that 20% might be the point that would drive the Europeans towards America. Not only did it not drive the Europeans towards America, the Iranians felt emboldened enough to go, and now they have one bomb's worth of 60%. So all of this is to say that there is no clear answer for this. And the Iranians understand that we have no clear answer. And it is one reason why they're able to kind of incrementally ratchet up the pressure. You saw in response to the way the Trump administration left the deal, in the first year, they watched and waited. And in the second year, they began the violations every 90 days. And in the third year, they paired up more of those violations grossly. So rather than doing 90-day increments, they did it in shorter periods, and the steps they took were bolder and more dangerous. There was even just an Iranian TV show I was watching on YouTube that had this Iranian political commentator, and he alleges this, and no one can really prove it, but he alleges that in response to the US withdrawal of the JCPOA, someone like Zarif, who many in the West think is some kind of brilliant or astute diplomat, he was talking about leaving the NPT then in 2018, but staying in the JCPOA. Now, of course, the ultra hardline Kayhan newspaper in Tehran was talking about leaving the NPT, which, my goodness, if you needed a technical or a political point to know when talks have ended, it's probably when the regime leaves a treaty that's supposed to regulate and talk about peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And that might be a good inflection point for you to stop those talks. So unfortunately, Plan C does not have that kind of a time frame. I've struggled in Washington thinking and talking for the past 2 years how we could come up with what is an appropriate timeline, what technical benchmark would be shared by some folks, what political benchmark would be shared by some folks, but no one across the Atlantic, on this side, across the aisle, on the other side of the aisle, this side of the aisle, wherever you stand, no one shares the same benchmark. So for me, the benchmark is already over. It's too little, too late. But for the people who matter and the people at the helm, that consensus doesn't seem to exist right now.
So this was a great segue into my next question, which you spoke about a series of statements earlier this year of a couple of weeks and we won't be able to come to a deal, and all of these deadlines come and go, and we find out they're not real deadlines. So the latest thing that we're seeing is the uninstalling of these 27 cameras, and Grossi saying if they're not reinstalled in 3 to 4 weeks, this could completely destroy the deal. The IAEA will not have any way to have that continuity of verification, and even if they reinstall them after, it doesn't matter. Do you believe that, one, Iran may reinstall those cameras, and this deadline of 3 to 4 weeks, do you believe that's a real deadline and this really could destroy everything? Or is this another just kind of empty statement trying to get Iran back to the table?
Well, this is, because this comes from Grossi, I don't see this as empty statements. I think he's tried very hard. And again, if one is constructing the story, no critiques, no compliments, just zooming out and seeing things as they are, the US has tried very hard. but someone who's tried even harder is the Director General of the IAEA to get Tehran to come back into compliance, to get Tehran to live up to more important non-proliferation agreements in the JCPOA, things like Iran's Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, things like additional protocol, to be able to verify and monitor the programs that Iran has and try to come up with some kind of blueprint or baseline for the things the regime has done. So if you do want to even have a fatally flawed deal or a lapsing deal or a deal that grants for some reason the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism enrichment on its own soil, you at least have some kind of a framework. This is, Grossi is not some warmongering individual. He's simply trying to keep this inspection and monitoring regime together. But since February 2021, when Iran really began to cut at the additional protocol, he's kept together this monitoring regime with spit and gum and glue, and without, and this is my critique now, without sufficient backing from Washington, and with Washington pulling its punches even on the diplomatic file. It took a year and a half to get a resolution of censure. And when you look at that language and compare it to the past resolution of censure, which I think was in June 2020, late in the Trump administration, language is not strong enough. And in my view, it doesn't provide enough of a linguistic glide path for Security Council referral. And I think the Iranians understand this. And I think that was absolutely the intention of the Biden administration, because again, they believe pressure drives the program. So they're looking to escalate in a certain way to achieve parity, not to escalate in a certain way to get Iran to respond or counter-respond in some way. So this is the Biden administration's theory of the case. But specifically to Grossi now, I think the moves Iran has made since February 2021 is exactly why that clock is real. It could be a little bit longer, it could be a little bit shorter, but the point is you got about a month since Iran installs these cameras where you, in that month's time, and that clock really actually is ticking, you will have less knowledge about Iran's nuclear facilities, about Iran's centrifuge program, and in particular about Iran's advanced centrifuges. And that was already gutted because of things that the regime was doing since February 2021, where we may have continuity but not access to things like component production for advanced centrifuges. So it's hard to get an accurate tally of how many advanced centrifuges does Iran have versus how many are slated to be produced versus how many components for the things that are slated to be produced, are being sourced, are being put together, or are being held separate, but not kind of amassed in one place. So you have a lot more questions than answers. And someone like me, who is a deal skeptic, will say, well, what is the point of a deal or reconstituting the JCPOA even in full in maybe, let's say, hypothetically August, when you may lose this 1 month? Because then you may get the verification and the baseline monitoring as defined by the AP, the CSA, and the JCPOA circa August, but you lose the summer. And the problem is, and have to quote Rumsfeld here, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what you lost. You don't know what was not monitored. And that lack of knowledge, it's not imperfect information, it's lack of information that makes one have to wildly speculate, wildly guess, and moves the ball from the IAEA arena of monitoring and verification deeper into the IC arena of HUMINT and SIGINT and national technical means and interception and signals and all these other things of US and other intelligence services have to work overtime to try to do. And that means that you do run more risks of getting it wrong, given the track record on this issue in the past. So suffice to say, it's not an empty timeline. Even if the administration attempts to course correct for it with a deal, there will still be gaps. But also the Iranians could try to dampen the situation in a few weeks' time by talking about, well, the move is reversible, and that may try to be done or said, not actually bringing them back, but simply talking about bringing them back, simply for the purposes of the Biden administration, not continuing along this path that we saw with the May oil sanctions and the June petrochemical sanctions.
So another question that we have posed is, the specific question is, do you think the UAE and Saudi Arabia would potentially cooperate in a Plan B scenario where maybe Israel is striking these facilities? But could you speak just a little bit more broadly? Where are the Gulf states in all of this? Obviously, Iran is a huge threat to them as well. How are they reacting to this? What are they thinking? If you could just speak a little bit to that.
This is, I'm glad you mentioned this. I do worry about the GCC states, in particular, not the ones that some may have written off, like Kuwait or Oman or Qatar even, but Saudi, Bahrain, and UAE, but more so Saudi and UAE in this sense, in terms of the people that Washington for more than a decade believed would kind of be the frontline hawks of the Arab order against Iran. And I think what these states have seen is such an oscillation and such a lack of political will from Washington that it is causing the kind of hedging that we're seeing now. So yes, while I'm critical that there is hedging there, and while I will say, hey, look, even at peak periods of pressure, the UAE did not cut or did not crack down on enough sufficiently the petrochemical trade. If you live in the neighborhood and you don't have the capabilities of a state like Israel, and you haven't had the kind of military effectiveness and the kind of military experiences that Israel has had, the game is drastically different. And the problem is the Iranians understand this. So I think the Iranian strategy towards the GCC states, but towards those two states that we spoke about in particular, potentially three, is to not make them Iranian stooges overnight, but to facilitate the divorce from America through highlighting the distrust and the lack of the US, who now for 3 different administrations has talked about leaving the region. Popularly, that seems to be the will here. You have 3 qualitatively different men, Obama, Trump, Biden, essentially saying the same thing about this, having these states pay their fair share, having these states be the ones who are getting us in this conflict. They've said different iterations of this, and that stuff hurts because the Americans should be having their backs. And ultimately, yes, I'm not going that far in the critique to say that the US has betrayed them. No, I don't think we're at this position yet, and I think you want less daylight and even less of a public critique between your partners. But it is a straining relationship. And when you look at the hedging and you look at the susceptibility of these states over time, from like Russia or China to be able to come into arms markets there, to come into economic markets there, to be able to discourage political reform and liberalization in these places there. The argument simply has to be, well, do you trust the Americans? Do the Americans have your back? And I think the kind of hedging we're seeing by some of the GCC states is indicative of that. We should always be in the business of trying to disprove, not prove the Islamic Republic. And there is a line Soleimani said, I think, in relevance to Syria or Iraq in 2010, which is that we're not like the Americans, we don't abandon our friends. We should be in the business of disproving this statement, not proving this statement. And so I do worry because you've seen multiple rounds of direct and bilateral diplomacy with Iran in some of these states. Yes, the Saudis have not reopened their embassy with Iran, and Iran has not reopened their embassy with Saudi, but it could happen. And while deal proponents might look at that as a net positive, one reason I would be skeptical of that is because the Iranians are engaging with these GCC states not out of goodwill. They're engaging with them to see how comfortable and uncomfortable are these GCC states at any given point in time with their security partnership and their political arrangement with Washington. Those are temperature-taking exercises by the Iranians. The Iranians are coming at you with one hand with a handshake and another hand with a knife from behind. And this knife from behind is basically the Houthis, for instance, expanding their targeting capabilities beyond KSA targeting UAE in early this year. Launching strikes at GCC states, not just from Yemen, but 2021 and 2022 from Iraq. People don't talk about that, but that happened. It's literally the definition of escalation: new weapons, new targets, new terrain, and the Iranians are able to widen their war. And the point of this war, again, is not to immediately rush and topple these regimes, even though Tehran does harbor strongly anti-Saudi and anti-Al Saud views. The goal here is to get them to, on balance, hedge more and accommodate rising Iranian power more by being distrustful of America. So ultimately, to frustrate that security relationship, to feed mistrust into mistrust, so that next time Tehran says jump, they simply have to jump, or that they get out of the way, or they're more accommodating of Iranian aggression and hegemony. And it's a very different kind of deliberative, slow approach to evict America, to establish hegemony. And in this sense, when you look at warming, GCC-China ties, there is going to be an economic component to it as well. I can't prove this, but Iran analysts do believe this, kind of when you talk to some of them. China analysts don't believe it, and Arab world analysts don't believe it. But Iran analysts who are seeing the hedging due to a rising Iran by Arab states seem to see this. And it's a conversation I've had with different stripes of Iran analysts throughout DC for the past few years. And that is to say that if the Arab order believes that Washington had their back, and Washington had their back to protect them from a rising Iran, since the JCPOA drama and since the lack of a coherent pushback against Iran under Democratic and Republican administrations, this GCC order, given that the trade balance in the past 2 decades has moved strongly towards China than the US, not just oil, but deepening business ties with GCC and China, what they are doing is rather than go to Iran's adversary to try to offset Iran, they're going to go to Iran's ally, China, to offset Iran. And so it's a hypothetical kind of futuristic scenario, but many Iran analysts see this happening, that Iran's adversaries would be going to Iran's allies, given how much oil China buys from both sides of the Persian Gulf, and see that as a potential mediating or balancing act, not in the short to medium term, but in the medium to long term. And that could only happen in a situation of diminishing US force presence in the region, more enabling of Iranian hegemony in the region, and probably on the back end of some kind of fatally flawed nuclear deal that does give the regime a patient pathway, and that leaves the Arabs left standing there saying, what happened to everything that you said and everything that you promised? So it's a very tough, very precarious scenario. And I do worry for the future of that partnership. Just look at how problematic and the potential Biden trip to Saudi is becoming.
And could you speak, that's actually my next question. So could you speak a little bit to that trip? There's been some questions of what is Biden trying to accomplish on this trip and, related to Iran. So if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, to kind of tie that to the first part of your question, which I realized I did not answer, and I apologize. I wanted to get this point about the handshake versus the knife cemented, because that is the Iranian MO towards the GCC. It's not to decapitate them. It's to get them to hedge and accommodate rising Iranian power by pointing mistrust and lack of reliability by Washington, to say they don't have your back. We're in the region. They're not. They keep talking about leaving. They want to counter the guy that's paying me. You're also getting paid by the guy that's paying me. So get out of my way. That's the Iranian MO here. To tie that in to this Plan B stuff, I don't know to what degree we should expect the GCC to have to be the military pushback or the front lines of military pushback on Iran, because they're already the military front lines. You see the drone strikes, you see the rocket strikes, you see the cruise missile strikes, you see the expansion of the war in Yemen, you see the naval issues. Unfortunately, the primary battlegrounds in the region, I mean, Israel, Syria is one major front, and I'm not saying it's contained, but things from Iraq all the way down to this side of the Persian Gulf, qualitatively different game. Like, heaven forbid that the kind of ballistic missile barrages that the Houthis were doing Riyadh 2017 and onward end up becoming daily against Israel. As far as I can count, there's only been 2 direct missile and or rocket responses from Syria operated by IRGC forces directly at Israel. There's been potentially more drone, but the competition has been more compartmentalized, potentially because the Iranians understand the capabilities that the Israelis have and some that the GCC may not have, but that could widen over time. And so, I do have my concerns about you may be asking too much of the GCC to have to play this second front line when their front line is already getting attacked and no one's really doing much about it. So what could Biden do or say? I mean, beyond the oil issue, I'm not sure what his intention is, because if you still are pursuing a deal, if you still want to leave the region, if you still see the relationship with the Saudis as merely transactional, and you don't believe in the kind of grand bargain that the Saudis and the Americans have had for more than half a century in the region, I don't know what ask the administration may have of the Saudis beyond oil output raising, things like that. And I don't know how they would act on whatever it is that the Saudis would ask them to do for regional security. There is a significant Abraham Accords angle to this, but I think that happens on the back end of trust. And there are some positive steps with Saudi and Israel, but I am beginning to think that these things may be going independently in the region more so than through the goading of Washington. Maybe if there's a different kind of administration and a different kind of Saudi-US relationship, that would change. But I do have my concerns over what would happen in the short term from this Biden-Saudi trip. I mean, I think that the trip is long overdue. I support the idea of a trip. I think you can talk tough to your friends. It should be done privately. It should be done in a different way. If you have issues, don't air your dirty laundry in public. There's a whole way to manage allies and partners that I think the Biden administration did not do a good job of. And I think there may have been an unfortunate early ideological or political motivation for that. Again, drawing a sharp contrast from Trump. But that is self-defeating and shooting yourself in the foot, especially because it's a nonpartisan policy proposition to say countering a rising Iran is in the US national security interest and preventing a nuclear Iran is in the US national security interest. And I intentionally put the regional one in front of the nuclear one, even though we all know a nuclear threat is, it would be a game changer.
So I'm probably only able to ask one more question. We only have like 4 minutes left. I'm going to combine two.
Sorry, my answers were long, I know.
No. This has been fantastic. I wish that we had you for 2 hours. So the last two questions connected that I'm going to ask you. One is, what, if anything, would it take for Iran to be able to genuinely be willing to give up their nuclear program? And tied to that, what items would you want to see in a nuclear deal, in a positive nuclear deal? Because obviously we'd be relieving a tremendous amount of sanctions. Iran gets a lot from a deal. So what would you want to see to be able to say this is a good deal? And do you think Iran is would generally be willing to give up the program for X, Y, or Z?
So let's begin with the last point first, which is the nuclear deal. I do not believe, this might be a controversial statement, I do not believe that a nuclear-only deal is in the US national security interest. Given our sanction structure, in any nuclear-only deal, you will be giving them more than you get. Now, if in this world, you very narrowly define US national security interest, and you ultimately see the Middle East as playing a much, much, much less of a role for US national security. I'm not just talking oil and pricing. I'm literally talking about your view as China, and unlike in the Cold War, you don't believe great power competition has a regional element. Hint, hint, it does. But if you believe this straight line talking point, all or nothing, get out, then one would see that as a worthwhile trade. But in my view, that you do not get to any worthwhile trade. If you pay the Iranians at any point in time, you're simply paying for a timeout. If the Iranians do like something, give you the perfect nuclear deal, which is, hypothetically, they give you the coordinates for every single place, and those places self-destruct or whatnot. Even then, well, you have this issue of lingering knowledge and the money that would end up underwriting the larger, longer standing threats that you have emanating from the Islamic Republic, which is the missile, military, terrorism, human rights, cyber, illicit finance, the regional menace, the things that have actually, the hostage taking, my goodness, the things that have made and sustained the Islamic Republic, the state-sponsored terrorism that we know, and that have kept it estranged for so long from the international community in the way that it has been. So there is no nuclear only deal. Some would critique me as saying you are making the perfect the enemy of the good. It doesn't mean I don't think that there can't be a deal. It doesn't mean I don't think that there can't be diplomacy. I think you totally do want diplomacy, a la the 12, if not 13 points of the previous administration. The 13th one being that you need a domestic human rights, pro-Iranian people component to that, which is maybe the next time there's an election, you have monitors there, or you actually, you have to get like some kind of promises by the IRGC and Besiege and law enforcement forces and vigilantes to leave people alone, or you have to have some kind of enforcement mechanism for the right to protest, or any of these things, but you can't really get that from this kind of regime. But it doesn't mean you can't try to negotiate with them over things in the region where the US and the Iranians are currently at loggerheads. And I think the approach where we've been at loggerheads in the recent era has been, well, in the places that we are at loggerheads, maybe if we stop competing, they'll stop competing. And a place like Iraq, for instance, or Syria might be an example of that. But we see when we stop competing, they actually end up being ascendant. So, my goal is to always be able to say, ideologically, politically, strategically, eyes on the prize. You want to support the Iranian people. That's where your head and the heart is. That's where the nexus is. You don't want any kind of potential agreement, technical, nuclear, whatever, to get in the way of that. That's the 50,000 foot big picture. You move a little bit closer in the short and the medium term. You want to be able to have a counter Iran policy that is nonpartisan, that is rooted, that actually has regional actors that do things in their own interest, which also end up being in the US interest, whether it's weapons, interceptions. You're not asking Saudi Arabia to become a different kind of state overnight. You're simply asking them to do what is in their interest, to defend themselves, to integrate air and missile defense systems, to share, to get information about early warning, to share that information with other GCC states, doing these kinds of things. And you don't want to negotiate on this component with the Iranians, meaning that if the Iranians have an issue with your infrastructure or the regional architecture, well, it's up to the Iranians to change, not to you. And then always in the short term, to be able to offer diplomacy with the Iranians and say, if you don't like that the fact that the regional order is against you, if you don't like that sanctions are squeezing you, well, then you actually have to stop what you're doing. And it's to always offer that diplomatic pathway, but to let them know that when they come to the table, that's when the rubber really does hit the road. That's where the tough decisions really need to be made, not for the US, but for the Iranians, because it is going to have to be behavioral things that they agree to. And one has to be honest, this regime has pursued a nuclear weapon because it resurrected the late Shah's nuclear program amid an 8-year war. So it always had a military dimension to its nuclear program. It was never a science fair project. And unfortunately, a nuclear deterrent does suit the regime's strategic interests. They have paid a lot for this. It's simply how they want to phase it in that makes them still susceptible to external stimuli. So while diplomacy and a deal is important, I think the more important thing is having a coherent, sustainable, and facts-based Iran policy. And I think that is really going to be the make or break for the US. Come any administration, come any midterm or presidential result, or having the policy in place to deter, detect, deny, devalue, and defang when needed, and punish when needed, is exactly that. And rather than move into the other is exactly why we need it. And rather than move into the other side of the spectrum, which is to say, let's reward them for timeouts, let's reward them, let's reintegrate them. No, because those things will end up being self-defeating. You want to create this denial and deterrent architecture such that you force a change.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll pass it over to Sarah to wrap up.
Thank you so much. Your brilliance never ceases to dazzle me. Okay. And thank you so much for you and for the wonderful work of FDD. And I believe very, very strongly, and Amit, one of our maxims is peace through strength, as President Ronald Reagan had said, not through appeasement. And let's hope that we can somehow get our American foreign policy back on track, with the wisdom and the help of people such as yourself and such of the work we do every day in Amit to try to inform our policymakers on Capitol Hill. I mean, we do need a course correction right now. Thank you so much. Please tune in next week. We will be hosting Colonel Sarit Zahavi, who is a retired colonel from the IDF. She has a fabulous think tank on Israel's north called Alma, where they are watching what is going on now that Russia is withdrawing from Syria to go fight their war in Ukraine, and what's going on to fill the gap. And with 150,000 Iranian supplied missiles of Hezbollah staring down at Israel, many of which have been converted into precision guided munitions, and how Israel is preparing for an eventuality where Iran does cross the threshold and probably has into nuclear power, and how Israel is preparing itself for that eventuality. Again, thank you so much, Behnam, and thank you so much to our audience for tuning in today.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
Okay, thank you. Bye.